A quiet sidewalk in Charleston, or a trap waiting to be sprung when two corrupt officers decide to harass and arrest an elderly black man for simply standing outside a gallery. But what they don't know is this man isn't just anyone. He's a retired appellate judge with friends in the highest places and a lifetime of battles under his belt. What follows isn't just a legal fight, it's an unraveling of power, lies, and the system that protects them. And trust me, you're not going to believe how far this goes until we get into it. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, and if you stand for justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It was just after 7 on a muggy Charleston evening when Charles C.J. Jennings stepped onto the quiet sidewalk outside the Carolina Low Country Gallery, his cane tapping softly against the uneven bricks as he settled into his usual stance, back straight shoulders, slightly hunched hands folded loosely behind him. The sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the cobbled street, stretching past the storefronts and flickering gas lamps that lined the historic district, with an old-world charm that belied the tension often simmering just beneath the surface. CJ stood in the golden spill of one of those lamps, the brim of his weathered straw fedora casting a half-moon of shade across his dark-lined face as he waited for his granddaughter Elise to finish her art talk inside. The gallery buzzed with youthful energy. He could hear the laughter, the rustle of shifting feet, the occasional clink of wine glasses through the open door. But CJ had chosen to stay outside, preferring the quiet of the street to the noise of a crowd he no longer had the energy to navigate. His suit was old but tailored pressed with care that morning, out of habit more than necessity, the way he'd always done things since his days in courtrooms where appearances could tilt the balance of respect. The air was thick with the smell of magnolia and salt water, and above the hum of distant traffic and cicadas, he could hear jazz floating faintly from a radio somewhere down the block, saxophone notes curling around the humidity like smoke. He checked his watch, an old silver Seiko with a cracked face, the one his late wife gave him after his last promotion, then looked up just as a police cruiser rolled slowly past its engine, low and lazy, like a beast circling without urgency, but not without interest. CJ didn't flinch, he never did, but his body remembered, the way some men looked at him in uniform and out, the way silence could turn dangerous when someone had a badge and something to prove. The cruiser idled across the street, headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, and for a moment, nothing moved but the beads of sweat sliding down CJ's neck. Then the passenger door creaked open, and two figures stepped out, young, white, uniformed, and carrying themselves like the street belonged to them. The taller one, lean and wiry, adjusted his belt with a sharp tug and scanned the sidewalk like he was already sure of what he was about to find. The other, broader, with a buzz cut that matched the rigid set of his jaw, squinted in CJ's direction, then nodded toward him with a motion that said, "There's our guy." CJ sighed through his nose, quiet and steady, his fingers tightening around the knob of his cane just enough to feel the wood press back. "Evening, sir," the lean one said, stepping close, voice coated in that faux politeness that always came before something unpleasant. "You mind telling us what you're doing here?" CJ turned his head slowly, deliberately, and met the officer's eyes without a flinch. "Waiting for my granddaughter," he said, calm, measured, not deferent but not confrontational either. "She's inside. I'm not disturbing anyone." The officer Cole, according to his badge, tilted his head slightly like he didn't like the answer but didn't yet know why. "Funny," he muttered, circling a half-step to CJ's left, "because we got a call about a suspicious male loitering outside this gallery. Fits your description. You wouldn't happen to have ID on you, would you?" CJ blinked slowly, the corner of his mouth twitching in something not quite a smile. "My description?" he asked, voice still level, though a quiet ember of irritation was beginning to smolder in his chest. "Which part black, old, or dressed too well for your liking?" The other cop, Larkin, took a step forward, his boots scraping the sidewalk with a sound like a dragged chair across concrete. "Let's just see some ID, sir," he said, but the word "sir" came out like something bitter. CJ nodded once slowly, and reached into his coat pocket with exaggerated care, every inch of movement rehearsed from decades of knowing exactly how fast was too fast when a gun might be drawn on reflex. He produced his wallet and held it out, but Cole made no move to take it. Instead, he slapped it from CJ's hand, the leather case flipping through the air before hitting the curb and spilling open card's license, a faded photo of Elise as a child, tumbling out like loose change. "Oops," Cole said flatly, and Larkin smirked, stepping forward to grind his heel into the wallet. CJ felt his heart rate spike, not with panic but with something colder, sharper, a warning bell that had rung too many times before. He bent slightly slowly to retrieve his things, but before he could touch them, Larkin nudged his cane with the toe of his boot, forcing CJ back upright. "You don't belong here," Cole muttered, his tone losing the last shred of civility. "This isn't the kind of street where folks like you hang around after dark." CJ's jaw set a lifetime of courtroom restraint, locking his anger behind his teeth. He stood taller as much as his back would allow and stared straight at Cole. "Officer," he said, his voice quieter now but firmer, older, layered with weight and history. "You're about to make a mistake. You can't walk back." Cole laughed. "You threatening me now, old man?" "I don't make threats," CJ said, "simply I make calls." For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the cruiser idling behind them and the slight startled shuffle of a gallery guest stepping out into the street with a plastic cup of rosé, catching the scene, then stepping hastily back inside. Cole moved fast, grabbing CJ's arm with unnecessary force, jerking him around as Larkin moved in with the cuffs. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting," he barked, though CJ had done neither. The cold bite of metal snapped against his wrists tight enough to numb his fingers, and CJ grunted as Larkin shoved him against the cruiser's hood. The heat from the engine seared through his blazer. "This is unnecessary," he managed through clenched teeth, "and illegal." "You'll have time to discuss that downtown," Cole sneered, hauling him toward the open back door. CJ didn't resist, didn't shout. But as his head dipped to enter the car, his eyes met the reflection in the side mirror, his own face blood trickling from a small cut on his brow, where it had grazed the edge of the hood, his expression unreadable. He let out a breath, and leaned his head back against the seat, the door slamming shut beside him. And for a few seconds before they drove off into the Charleston dusk, the only thing CJ could hear was the soft buzz of his phone still tucked in his inside pocket, vibrating like a second heartbeat against his chest. He closed his eyes and made a decision. When the time came, he would make that call. Not to plead, not to argue, but to remind them quietly, unshakably, that the man they had tried to humiliate had once written the very opinions they now trampled underfoot. They didn't even wait for the car to pull away from the curb before things turned ugly, like the arrest was just the appetizer, and the real violence was the main course they'd been hungry for all night. The moment the cruiser's door slammed shut behind him, CJ could feel it, the way the energy in the air shifted, thickening like a summer storm, not loud but heavy, tense. The kind of silence that doesn't come with peace, but with the slow build-up of something about to snap. The taller officer, Cole, climbed into the driver's seat without a word, adjusting the mirror just enough to catch CJ's eyes in the reflection, a smirk ghosting across his face, as if he found something amusing in watching an old black man bleed quietly in the back seat. The cruiser pulled away from the gallery and rolled down the narrow street, tires humming low over the cobblestone's headlights, cutting a crooked path through the shadows of hanging Spanish moss. CJ leaned his head back against the cool vinyl seat, the cuffs tight around his wrists and digging into the bones beneath his skin every time the car hit a bump. A trickle of blood had started to dry near his temple, matting the hair along his hairline, and his ribs ached from the way they'd twisted him around too fast, too rough, without a shred of care. He had known violence before, but never like this, not this casual, not this bored, like they were flipping through a menu and had decided on pain because it was the cheapest thing they could afford to serve. "Bet you never thought your night would end like this, huh, old man?" Larkin said, not turning around, just tossing the words back into the cab like cigarette ash. His voice was light, like a joke told too many times by someone who stopped caring whether it landed. CA didn't respond. He just kept his eyes fixed on the back of Cole's head, memorizing the way the man's neck tightened every time he pressed the gas, the way his right hand flexed on the steering wheel, as if clenching and unclenching something invisible. He could feel the heat from the engine leaking into the car, mingling with the humidity and the sharp metallic scent of blood. His blood, and he let the silence stretch, not because he had nothing to say, but because some men only understood the weight of quiet when it was filled with everything they tried to avoid. The car jerked to a stop near an empty strip mall, the lights flickering weakly from a broken liquor store sign, as Cole threw the car into park with a grunt. "Let's make sure he gets the message," he said, opening his door and stepping out into the thick night air. Larkin followed, and CJ felt a flicker of something cold run through him. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the deep sinking, knowing that some decisions get made in dark places when no one else is around. The back door swung open, and before CJ could shift his weight or even ask what was happening, Larkin reached in, grabbing him by the arm and yanking him out with the kind of force that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with dominance. CJ's feet hit the ground unevenly, his cane still locked in the trunk where they'd tossed it, and without its support he stumbled forward, barely catching himself before he went down to one knee. The parking lot was empty, save for a few shattered beer bottles near the curb, and the sound of crickets chirping like nothing out of the ordinary was happening. "On your knees," Cole said, voice lower, now more serious, the smirk gone, and replaced with something colder, flatter like this wasn't play anymore. "We're gonna have a little talk about respect." CJ looked up at him, the air burning in his lungs, his body aching from the strain. "You don't want to talk," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You want to show." That was when the first hit came. Not a slap, not a punch, but a quick, brutal jab from Larkin's baton to his side right beneath the ribs where he'd been twisted earlier. The pain flared bright and sudden, knocking the breath from his chest and sending him to one knee before he could stop it. Another strike followed, this time to his shoulder, and CJ grunted, curling slightly, but refusing to fall all the way. "You think you're better than us?" Larkin hissed, standing over him now, sweat beading at his temples. "With your fancy words and your little suits like that makes you untouchable." CJ lifted his head, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. "I don't think I'm better," he murmured, breathing through the pain. "I just know who I am." That was what set Cole off. Maybe the tone, maybe the fact that CJ hadn't broken, hadn't begged. He stepped forward, grabbing CJ by the collar and yanking him upright before slamming him back against the side of the cruiser, hard enough that CJ saw stars for a moment. The metal was hot behind him, and the world spun slightly on its axis, the shadows of the parking lot stretching like arms around them. "You don't talk to us like that," Cole spat, his hand tightening on CJ's collar. "You don't look us in the eye like you're on our level." CJ coughed, a sharp burst of pain tearing through his chest, but he didn't look away. "I've sat higher benches than either of you ever will," he whispered, and that was when the punch landed right across his face, splitting his lip and snapping his head to the side like a rag doll. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was filled with the thrum of blood in his ears, the distant wail of a siren somewhere far off, the quiet crunch of gravel under Cole's shifting weight. CJ felt his knees start to buckle, but he locked them tight, refusing to fall. He'd been hit before in war, in courtrooms, in life, but never by someone who thought the badge made them God and cruelty a birthright. They left him like that, propped against the side of the cruiser, blood dripping onto the pavement, cuffs still tight, and his chest heaving with effort. Cole lit a cigarette and leaned against the hood like it was any other night, like this was nothing more than a pit stop on their patrol. Larkin watched CJ quietly, his face unreadable now, no longer smiling, but not ashamed either. "You should have walked away," Cole said, exhaling smoke into the warm air, his voice more tired than angry now. "Now you're ours." CJ didn't answer. He couldn't. His jaw throbbed and his vision was blurry, one eye starting to swell. But in his mind a single thought had taken root, steady and burning through the fog. They think they own the night because no one's watching. But they forgot. Someone always is. Asterisk. As they shoved him back into the car and drove off toward the station, CJ closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in focus. Somewhere deep inside, behind the bruises and the blood, a switch had flipped. Not fear, not rage, but resolve. They'd drawn first blood thinking it was the end of a man. But what they'd actually done was wake the part of him that had written rulings with fire and peeled back injustice like skin. He wasn't finished. Not yet. In the dim back seat of the police cruiser, with blood drying along his cheek and his hands cuffed too tight behind his back, CJ Jennings sat in silence that was not resignation but calculation, sharp, deliberate, and heavy with everything he had not said. The engine rumbled beneath him like a low growl, and outside the tinted window, the blurred lights of Charleston rolled past in streaks of amber and red, distorted by sweat and pain clouding his vision. Every jolt of the car sent a tremor through his ribs, and though he winced, he made no sound, choosing instead to keep his eyes fixed forward, not looking at the mirror where he knew Cole was occasionally sneaking glances to gauge how close he was to breaking. They didn't speak to him now. The earlier mockery had faded into silence, the cruel delight of violence giving way to the dull routine of paperwork and holding cells. But CJ had seen that look in their eyes, the one that came not from justice but from fear masquerading as control. He shifted his weight slightly enough to feel the sting in his side and the tight pinch where the cuffs dug into his skin, but more importantly enough to confirm what he suspected, that in their arrogance they hadn't searched him thoroughly. They'd stripped him of his cane, roughed him up, tossed him in the car, but they'd missed the small, battered flip phone tucked inside the inner pocket of his blazer, nestled against his chest like a secret lifeline. That phone wasn't smart, wasn't flashy, didn't take pictures or scroll through apps. It just did one thing, and right now, that one thing was enough. CJ waited until the car slowed, crawling through a traffic light near an empty intersection, and used the momentary stillness to shift again, pressing his back against the seat in a way that let his fingers brush the corner of the device. It took careful effort, inch by inch, wrist flexing against metal shoulders, stiff with pain, but after a few moments of uncomfortable maneuvering, he felt the familiar shape slip into his palm. He lowered his head slightly, shielding his hands with his body as best he could, and used the tip of his thumb to flip the phone open in his lap. The screen lit dimly, a soft blue glow against his bruised skin, and he exhaled slowly, quietly, as if even that breath might draw attention. He scrolled through the short list of numbers, most of them long since inactive or belonging to voices he hadn't heard in years, until he landed on one marked simply as Graham, DC**. He hesitated just for a moment, not because he doubted her, but because making this call meant crossing a line he'd spent years trying not to need. He had always believed in letting people rise on their own terms, believed in not pulling favors or invoking names, unless it truly mattered. But this was different. He wasn't calling to get out of trouble. He was calling to remind the system who he was, and more importantly, who was still watching. With one final glance at the rearview mirror, where Cole's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, CJ pressed the call button and brought the phone to his shoulder, hiding it beneath his chin as best he could. The line rang once, then twice, before clicking to life with a soft tone and a voice he hadn't heard in nearly 5 years, but could have recognized in any courtroom in the country. Chief Justice Marcia Graham, the voice said, crisp and alert even at this hour. CJ didn't waste time. "It's me," he said, voice low but steady, carrying the weight of old respect and shared war stories no one else would ever know. "Charles Jennings." There was a pause, sharp intake of breath, then the rustle of movement like she had just stood up from her desk. "CJ," she said, her tone shifting, instantly layered with shock and concern. "Where the hell are you?" He swallowed hard, the copper taste of blood still thick in his mouth. "In the back of a patrol car. Charleston PD. Beaten. No charges. No cause. Just 2 uniforms and a grudge." "Jesus," she breathed, then sharper. "Names. Cole and Larkin," he answered, watching the road signs flash past. "No badge numbers yet. Young. Arrogant. Same old blueprint." "I'm making the call now," she said. "You hang on. DOJ. Internal Affairs. The whole damn bench. You'll be out by sunrise." CJ nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Marcia," he added quietly, "make it fast." The line clicked off, and for a moment, the silence that followed felt like a door closing on something old, and a different one, creaking open, one filled with fire and weight and consequences that Cole and Larkin couldn't even begin to imagine. He flipped the phone shut and slid it back into his pocket, his movements slow, careful, as he straightened up again in the seat, his breathing shallow but steady. Outside, the cruiser turned down a side street toward the precinct, and CJ caught the faint flash of red and blue bouncing off the brick walls, painting the world in short strobe-like pulses. He shifted again this time to relieve the pressure on his wrists and allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction because they still didn't know what they'd done. They hadn't arrested some old man waiting on a sidewalk, they'd dragged a retired appellate judge off the street, a man who once mentored the sitting Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. They'd bloodied a scholar, shackled a veteran, mocked a grandfather, and now, whether they liked it or not, they'd triggered a chain reaction that would not stop quietly behind closed doors. As the car rolled to a halt in front of the precinct, CJ lifted his head and looked straight into the rearview mirror, locking eyes with Cole again. His lip was split, and one cheek had begun to swell, but his gaze didn't waver. He didn't blink. He just looked at the man who thought he'd won, and thought, "You have no idea what you've set in motion." Asterisk. And then the door opened, and the night spilled in again, humid and heavy with consequences. The call lasted no more than 30 seconds, but its weight lingered like a low drumbeat beneath the skin of the night, reverberating quietly through the wires and into the hands of people who still remembered what justice was supposed to mean. As the cruiser pulled into the cracked concrete lot behind the Charleston precinct, CJ sat upright back, pressed to the seat, eyes scanning the station, exterior weather-worn brick, a sagging awning and fluorescent lights that flickered above the intake door like they too were tired of pretending everything inside was in working order. The car door opened with a sharp creak, and before he could brace himself, Larkin yanked him out, one hand tight around his arm, the other pushing his shoulder to guide him roughly toward the metal double doors that led to booking. CJ didn't resist, didn't stagger, didn't give them the satisfaction of weakness. His feet moved with quiet purpose even as pain pulsed through his ribs and echoed in his jaw the warmth of dried blood crusted against his collarbone. He kept his eyes forward, walking past the younger officer on desk duty who didn't even look up from his keyboard, as CJ was escorted past the intake counter and down a dim hallway that smelled like bleach, bad coffee, and the kind of institutional fatigue that seeps into the tile grout and never leaves. They processed him without ceremony. Fingerprints, a mugshot taken with a cracked camera lens, and a curt command to turn to the side, barked by someone who clearly hadn't read the memo that their suspect had just rung the phone line of the nation's highest bench. They didn't ask him why he was there. They didn't explain the charges. They just moved with the cold precision of men following orders and avoiding questions, their indifference almost more dangerous than their violence. CJ stood still beneath the camera. Flash, his expression unreadable, his shoulders squared like a man bracing for a second blow before the first one had finished landing. Back in Washington, Justice Marcia Graham stood at the edge of her office window, phone still in hand, her reflection dark against the glass as the Capitol lights glimmered behind her like distant stars. Her mind moved faster than her breath, cataloging names, weighing risks, reaching for the right pressure points. She didn't hesitate. There were things you didn't sit on, no matter the hour, no matter the optics. She pressed a second line and spoke one name with a quiet finality that ended the conversation before it began. Get the Deputy Attorney General. Now. Within minutes, messages flew across secure lines. Federal liaisons were pulled from dinner tables. A DOJ official was dispatched from Atlanta with an encrypted tablet and an unmarked vehicle. Somewhere in a corner of the Justice Department's internal database, a red flag was raised on the Charleston PD, a flag that hadn't been touched since the 1990s, buried beneath sealed files and forgotten lawsuits. Tonight, it glowed again. Inside the holding cell, CJ sat on a hard bench bolted to the wall, the concrete cool beneath him, and the echo of dripping water tapping faintly from somewhere beyond the bars. His cuffs had been removed, but the ghost of them lingered in the deep ridges along his wrists, red and raw from the strain. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands folded together like a man at prayer or war or something in between. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't sleep. He just sat in the hush of institutional stillness, listening, counting footsteps, memorizing the cadence of voices behind closed doors, tracing patterns in the overhead flicker of a dying light bulb. Somewhere down the hall, a young officer chuckled at something on his phone. Farther down, someone cursed over a jammed copy machine. And above it all, CJ waited calm, patient, but not idle. He was letting them settle into the false sense of control that made weak men arrogant, the kind of confidence that only lasts until a name echoes down the wrong hallway and someone with a badge starts sweating through their shirt. When it came, it didn't come with sirens or shouting or a dramatic slamming of doors. It came with a car pulling up to the precinct's side, lot black and silent, its headlights cutting clean across the alley like a scalpel. It came with two federal marshals in plain suits, their expressions unreadable, their shoes polished, their badges tucked in leather cases they didn't need to flash. It came with a clipboard, a list of questions, and a tone of voice that said, "Asterisk, we're not here to negotiate. We're here because someone made a mistake, and that mistake has a name, asterisk." The desk sergeant blinked twice when he saw them, then cleared his throat and tried to stall shuffling papers and muttering something about protocols. One of the marshals tilted his head, smiled politely, and said, "You have 30 seconds to open the cell, or we make this your last shift." 10 minutes later, the door to CJ's holding cell clicked open, the officer behind it looking everywhere except into his eyes as he mumbled, "You're being released. Orders from D.C." CJ stood without a word, stepping past the man as though he didn't exist, his spine straight, despite the ache running like fire through his ribs. In the hallway, the two marshals flanked him, saying nothing, only offering a brief nod of acknowledgement like old warriors passing each other on the battlefield, no words necessary. Outside, the night air hit him like a tide, cool and thick, with the scent of damp earth and distant salt water, the humidity wrapping around his lungs like a second skin. He took one step, then another, until he reached the curb where the black car waited its back door, open, a silhouette visible inside. It was Elise. Her face, pale eyes rimmed with fury, and something deeper, fear maybe, or disbelief. But when she saw him, something inside her cracked, and she rushed forward, arms out, voice trembling, with something she hadn't felt since she was a child. "Grandpa," she whispered, holding him like she was afraid to let go. "They said they hit you. I saw the video. They didn't even God. Are you okay?" CJ rested one hand on her shoulder, firm but gentle. "I'm here," he said simply, and that was all it took. The air around them settled into a stillness not of peace but of pause, the kind of moment where grief and gratitude coexist in the same breath. Behind him, the precinct lights still flickered, and beyond the city skyline, storm clouds gathered against a horizon that was far from finished. But for now, CJ stood with his granddaughter beneath the Charleston street lamps, bruised but unbroken, a quiet weight in his chest that said, "This isn't over, but I'm still standing." Asterisk. The cell was smaller than CJ remembered them, being just a slab of concrete, pretending to be a bench. A flickering bulb overhead that cast a yellowed, sickly light against the scraped-up walls, and a lingering smell of sweat, and something sour that had soaked so deep into the cinder blocks it could never be scrubbed out. He sat, hunched forward, elbows resting on his thighs, hands clasped together loosely, as if he were still holding something invisible between them. Maybe a gavel, maybe the weight of restraint, or maybe just time itself stretched too thin, too heavy to carry without letting it settle into his bones. The throb in his ribs had dulled to a steady ache, the kind that doesn't clamor for attention but refuses to be forgotten, like the echo of a name you don't want to say out loud. Across the hallway, voices drifted in and out, officers, barking into phones, typing with too much force, laughing at jokes no one outside their circle would find funny. No one came to check on him. No one offered him water. They figured he was harmless, now boxed up and quiet, another old man with a bloodied face who would leave with less dignity than he arrived. What they didn't know, what they couldn't begin to understand, was that CJ wasn't waiting for mercy. He was waiting for momentum. Out front, a different kind of energy had started to rise. Elise had not gone home. She hadn't even sat down. She stood firm at the front desk, her blazer damp from the heat, her curls frizzing at the edges, her jaw set, in the same way CJ's used to lock during closing arguments. "Where is he?" she asked again, her voice steady but loud enough to catch attention from the officers pretending not to listen. "You've had him in custody for over an hour, and no one will tell me where he is or what he's charged with." The officer behind the desk, young, uninterested, hiding his uncertainty behind a smirk, shrugged and said, "You'll have to wait, ma'am. He's being processed." Elise didn't blink. Instead, she pulled her phone from her bag, tapped the screen twice, and held it up with the camera rolling. "Say that again," she said, her voice colder now, "because I want the public to hear it. This is Charles Jennings, retired appellate judge, and you're holding him without cause." A few heads turned. A few murmurs passed. That name Jennings meant something to some of the older officers. It triggered a flicker of unease, the kind that doesn't come from fear of doing something wrong but from the dawning realization that maybe they already had. "You need to leave," the officer said, his tone sharper now, reaching for the easy threat of authority. "Filming isn't allowed here." "I'm not leaving," Elise said, her voice never rising, just anchoring deeper. "And this video is already uploading." That was when the air shifted. The phones at the precinct began to ring, first one, then another, then a chorus of them like warning bells bouncing off the tile floors. Some officers looked up, others exchanged glances. There was a sudden stiffness in the room, like someone had turned down the oxygen and dialed up the pressure. The desk sergeant picked up a line, spoke quietly, then froze. His eyes scanned the room before locking on Elise. He hung up the phone with too much care, then cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, softer now. "Someone's coming. Please wait over there." She didn't thank him. She just stepped back, phone still recording her fingers, trembling now, not from fear, but from restraint. Outside, the sky had darkened, further clouds rolling in over the marsh with the thick weight of late summer rain. A warm breeze swept through the parking lot, kicking up bits of paper and dust, like the city itself was preparing for something. In the hallway near the cells, a shift commander stepped in and looked down at the logbook, then up at CJ behind the bars. His expression didn't hold the same smug detachment as the others. There was something more careful in his stance, more alert. "Mr. Jennings," he said, clearing his throat, "you'll be released shortly." CJ tilted his head, studying the man's face the way he used to study witnesses, looking for the flicker of doubt, the tightness around the jaw, the tells that betray a man trying to make a wrong thing sound right. "Why now?" CJ asked, voice hoarse but calm. "I've been here over an hour without a charge." The man hesitated, then said, "There was a call." "From DC?" CJ nodded slowly, pressing his palms against his knees to help push himself upright. The pain flared through his side, but he didn't flinch. He moved like someone who still remembered what it meant to carry himself under oath. When they uncuffed him and walked him out of the cell, the air felt different, thicker, charged like a room holding its breath. No one met his gaze. The officers who had shoved him through the doors now kept their distance, their confidence fraying at the edges, like an old flag caught in a new wind. As CJ stepped into the lobby, the room fell silent, the kind of silence that comes not from guilt but from exposure. Elise stepped forward, her phone lowering slowly as she caught sight of him, blood still crusted along his cheek suit, wrinkled but his back as straight as the day he swore in for the bench. "Grandpa," she whispered, crossing the space between them. He looked at her and managed the smallest smile, soft but steady. "They forgot," he said quietly, "who they were dealing with." And though his body ached and the bruises still bloomed beneath his skin, in that moment he stood not as a victim or a defendant, but as a man reclaiming something. They'd tried to take his dignity, his name, and the quiet, immovable strength of someone who knew exactly how the law was supposed to work. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping gently against the sidewalk like the softest applause. By the time the sun came up over Charleston's harbor, the next morning painting the sky in streaks of amber and slate, CJ Jennings was already awake, seated at his kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hands, his body still sore, but his mind wide open and alert. The house around him, modest and quiet, smelled faintly of old books and lemon oil, the floor creaking under the weight of every small movement, as if the home itself knew it was sheltering a man who'd nearly been erased the night before. Elise had fallen asleep on the couch just a few hours earlier, still in her work clothes, one arm curled over her head, her phone resting on her chest with the screen dark. But CJ hadn't slept, not because he couldn't, but because part of him refused to surrender that easily. He'd spent the early hours reviewing every moment, every face, every tone of voice and flick of the wrist that might reveal a motive deeper than bruised egos or power trips gone unchecked. What unsettled him wasn't just the cruelty of the arrest, but how quickly it had been dismissed by the very people sworn to oversee the law. The silence from the Charleston Police Department spoke louder than any press release could. No apology, no explanation, just a procedural ghosting, like they hoped the incident would vanish in the shuffle of the next news cycle. But CJ knew better. He always had. The kind of injustice he'd encountered wasn't random, it was systemic, embedded and protected by those with more to lose than a simple reprimand. At precisely 8:14 a.m. Elise's phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the morning stillness like a sudden crack in glass. She stirred, sat up slowly, blinked hard, then looked at the screen. "Unknown number," she muttered, handing it to CJ. "It's probably for you," he answered with a calmness that masked the heat still simmering beneath his skin. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and cold. "Mr. Jennings, this is Sheriff Dale Maynard. I assume you're aware of the incident involving our officers last night." CJ said nothing at first, letting the silence press against the man's words until it grew uncomfortable. "I'm aware of the beating," he finally said, "and the false arrest. You'll have to be more specific about what you consider an incident." There was a pause, just long enough to confirm CJ had struck a nerve, then Maynard's tone tightened. "My office is conducting an internal review. I expect you'll respect that process." CJ's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened like glass under pressure. "I've spent my life respecting processes, Sheriff. What I no longer have patience for is cowardice masquerading as protocol." The call ended without resolution, but the message had landed. By noon, Elise's video had been shared over 100,000 times, picked up by local journalists, and slowly creeping into national news cycles. A few outlets called it what it was, profiling assault misconduct, but most took a cautious tone, hedging their headlines with words like alleged and controversial. CJ knew that dance too well. He'd watched it play out for decades, the slow sanitization of brutality through legal language and editorial distance. But this time there was something different in the air, an undercurrent faint but building like a storm, forming offshore before the winds even touch land. That afternoon a knock came at the front door, 3 short raps followed by a pause, then a fourth, not aggressive but firm. Elise rose first, but CJ stopped her with a look. He walked to the door himself, opened it slowly, and found a woman standing on the porch in a gray suit and dark sunglasses, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and a press badge clipped to her lapel. "Maya Torres," she said, offering her hand. "Civil rights attorney. I'm not here officially, yet. But I've been following your name since last night." CJ studied her carefully, the way she stood, the measured cadence of her voice, the careful choice not to overstep. He gestured for her to come in. Over the next hour, they talked quietly in the living room, while Elise brewed fresh coffee in the background. Maya had seen enough in her years of practice to recognize a pattern, and CJ in turn had seen enough to recognize when someone wasn't bluffing. "There's a pattern here," she said, tapping her fingers gently against her notepad. "Your arrest, it fits too neatly. Same precinct, same officers. Similar stories, older black men professionals, all with just enough visibility to be inconvenient, and all dismissed without cause." CJ nodded slowly. "They're not acting on their own. Someone higher up is pulling strings, covering it just well enough to escape scrutiny." Maya didn't argue. She just pulled out a file from her bag and laid it on the coffee table. "Here's what I know," she said. "Sheriff Maynard brought in those 2 officers, Cole and Larkin, from another county last year after a so-called restructuring. But their personnel files show multiple complaints, excessive force targeting black residents, questionable evidence handling, no disciplinary action, not one." CJ leaned forward, fingers brushing the edge of the file, reading names and dates with growing clarity. This wasn't just about him anymore. It hadn't been from the start. This was a pattern stitched into the seams of Charleston's justice system, camouflaged under layers of bureaucracy and silence. "I want to file suit," Elise said suddenly, her voice breaking through the quiet. "They can't just keep doing this to people. Someone needs to answer for what they did to him." Maya looked at CJ. "It's your call," she said softly. "You press it and it doesn't stop. They'll come for you harder than they did last night, but you'll have leverage this time. People are watching." CJ closed the file, exhaled long and slow, and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the room held nothing but the sound of the ceiling fan spinning above them, blades slicing through the warm air like seconds slipping past a clock. Then he looked up and said, "We don't just press, we pull the whole thread." And with those words, a quiet decision settled over the room like dust, finding its way to Wood, steady, undeniable, and ready. By the time the lawsuit was officially filed, the story had already spread beyond Charleston, carried by the voices of strangers who saw something familiar in CJ's bruised face and Elise's trembling hands. It wasn't just a story about one man anymore. It had become something wider, something heavier, a mirror held up to a system that had long relied on silence to survive. But silence was no longer an option. With every article published, with every video clip replayed, with every comment thread that refused to fade, the momentum grew louder, more insistent, until it wasn't a question of whether the city would respond, but how long it could keep pretending not to. At first, the attacks came quietly. A whisper campaign launched from somewhere behind polished desks and paneled offices, seeded doubt through subtle headlines and backdoor conversations. Columnists questioned CJ's motives. Anonymous sources hinted that he had antagonized officers, that his reputation for confrontation was well known. Elise found her emails flooded with veiled threats and smug warnings disguised as concern. Even Maya Sharp has ever received a call from a state bar official requesting a review of her caseload, thinly veiled behind bureaucratic language that tried to sound routine. CJ, for his part, expected it. He had sat on enough benches, ruled over enough hearings, to know that when you threaten a crooked foundation, the whole house shakes, and the people inside rarely go quietly. Still, there was something chilling about how fast the pushback moved, like it had been waiting for a reason to act, like it had contingency plans drawn up long before he'd ever been thrown into the back of that cruiser. "I know this dance," CJ told Maya one morning, seated across from her at her small office desk, sunlight streaking through the blinds behind him in dusty shafts of gold. "You corner power and it doesn't fight. It corrodes everything around you first until you look like the problem." Maya nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against a stack of affidavits. "That's exactly why we have to stay ahead of it. Emotion doesn't win in court, evidence does." She flipped open a file and laid a photograph on the table, a screenshot from a private security camera across the street from the art gallery. In the frame, CJ stood alone under the street lamp, hands behind his back, posture composed. A moment later, frozen in another frame, Cole and Larkin crossed toward him with a swagger that now looked far less professional and far more calculated. "They said you were loitering. This shows you standing still, not bothering anyone," Maya said. "I've sent it to 2 independent analysts and a forensic specialist. We time-stamped everything. It holds." CJ studied the image quietly. It wasn't just that it cleared him, it was that it showed the officers for what they were, comfortable in their overreach, confident that no one would hold them accountable. That confidence chilled him more than the assault itself. But as the case gained traction, the smear campaign intensified. A local talk radio show accused him of using his past connections for personal gain. A blogger published a poorly sourced piece suggesting CJ's decades-old rulings had favored certain political interests. And in the comments, strangers debated his humanity as though it were a hypothetical, as though the blood on his collar could be dismissed with enough spin and doubt. Elise tried not to let it get to her, but CJ could see the wear in her shoulders, the fatigue behind her smile. One night, as she sat beside him scrolling through her phone with a tense jaw and tired eyes, he reached out and gently covered her hand with his own. "They don't know you," he said softly. "They don't know your heart, and they certainly don't know mine." She looked up, her expression fragile but holding. "They act like you asked for this, like standing on a sidewalk with your hands behind your back was some kind of provocation." CJ gave a faint nod. To people who fear truth, dignity looks like rebellion. Outside, protests had started to swell, not chaotic, not destructive, but steady, growing louder each day. Handmade signs, students marching with bullhorns, elderly residents showing up with folding chairs and water bottles. A quiet, persistent wave that filled city squares with chants and demands that could no longer be ignored. One sign read, "We stand with CJ." Another, held by a teenage boy barely old enough to drive, simply read, "That could have been my grandfather." The sheriff's office, once smug and silent, began to feel the pressure. Public records requests poured in. Reporters showed up unannounced. Deputies started calling in sick. Sheriff Maynard himself held a press conference, sweat beading beneath his collar, as he insisted the department took all allegations seriously while refusing to comment on pending litigation. But the cracks were showing, and people were watching. Still, the pressure weighed heavy on CJ. Each morning he woke with a dull pain in his side, not just from bruised ribs but from the weight of being made a symbol. He hadn't asked to become a movement. He hadn't set out to raise banners or lead chants. All he wanted was to protect the truth. But now the truth had a face, and it was his. He spent his afternoons preparing with Maya, reviewing statements, video evidence, case histories, old rulings that might now be twisted against him. But at night, he sat in the quiet of his home, sometimes alone, sometimes with Elise nearby, and let his breath slow enough to hear the wind in the trees outside, to feel the rhythm of the city as it shifted around him. One evening, after another long day of press inquiries and strategy sessions, CJ stood on his porch and watched a group of young people walk past his street, chanting his name softly like a prayer. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just stood there, hands resting on the porch railing, feeling the wood warm under his fingers, and allowed himself a single moment of stillness. In that moment, he wasn't a former judge or a victim of assault or the centerpiece of a growing legal firestorm. He was a man who had told the truth and who would keep telling it no matter who tried to bury it. And as the voices faded down the street, blending into the dusk, CJ closed his eyes and breathed deep, not because the fight was over, but because for the first time in a long time, he knew he wasn't in it alone. The footage came in quietly without fanfare, tucked inside a late-night email from a part-time security guard who worked weekends at the antique shop across the street from the gallery. Maya had almost missed it in her inbox, just a simple subject line, "Might help your case." But when she opened the file and scrubbed through the grainy timestamps, her breath caught in her throat. There it was, undeniable, unedited, and as damning as any sworn testimony. Charles Jennings standing alone under the warm halo of a street lamp, dressed in his suit, adjusting his cufflinks, waiting, calm, still, silent. Then two uniformed officers crossing toward him from across the road, their posture loose, their smiles thin, their body language laced with the kind of confidence that came not from righteousness but from the belief that no one was watching. Maya leaned forward, replayed it twice, then a third time, zooming in on the precise moment where one of the officers, Larkin, tilted his head, said something smugly, and pointed at CJ like he'd found a man out of place. From there, everything unraveled just as CJ had described it. No threat, no resistance, no justification. Just two officers unchecked, exercising a power that had never been meant for punishment, only protection, and twisting it until it snapped. By sunrise, the clip had been extracted, cleaned up, and distributed across every media contact Maya had cultivated over her 10-year career. No press conference, no speeches, just truth laid bare in pixels and time-stamped certainty. Within hours it exploded online. News anchors stopped mid-sentence to play it live on air. Commentators who had once been cautious began using words like evidence and pattern instead of allegation and incident. Strangers who had only known CJ's name from hashtags now saw his face as a mirror of someone they loved. Elise watched the video from the far end of the living room, her arms folded across her chest, her jaw tight. She didn't say much, but CJ could tell from the way her eyes stayed locked on the screen that something inside her had shifted. Not just the usual anger or hurt, but a kind of certainty that comes when someone stops wondering if they're overreacting and realizes the world has been gaslighting them all along. Maya walked in, laptop still open, her voice calm but electric. This changes everything, she said, not as a hope, but as a statement of fact. They can't spin their way out of this. It's not just your word anymore, it's their actions in real time. CJ didn't respond right away. He sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped in front of him, staring at a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. The video hadn't surprised him. What struck him, what still coiled in his chest, was how predictable it had all been. The assault, the lies, the silence. It was a playbook he'd seen too many times before. And yet something about seeing it from the outside, watching himself become a symbol on someone else's screen, felt surreal. They'll pivot, he said quietly. They'll say it's taken out of context, or that the camera angle doesn't show the full picture. Maya didn't argue. They'll try, she said, sitting down across from him. But they're scrambling. The footage is already circulating in places we don't control. It's not a press release they can contain, it's 100,000 eyes waking up. That afternoon, the Charleston PD released a brief statement acknowledging the footage and promising a thorough and impartial review, but no one bought it. The language was sterile, carved out of legal caution, and PR templates offering no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just an echo of responsibility meant to stall the inevitable. The mayor was next. He stood stiffly in front of a row of flags, blinking under the camera lights, calling for calm while refusing to name what had happened as wrong. And all the while, the footage kept playing. On television, on phones, projected onto the side of a downtown building by a group of local artists who believed protest didn't have to be loud to be powerful. CJ stayed home that day, not because he was hiding, but because there was nowhere else to go that felt more honest. He sat near the window, watching neighbors walk past more slowly than usual, some of them offering small waves, others just nodding with eyes that said, "We saw it too." At one point, a small envelope was slipped through the mail slot. No return address, just a short, handwritten note inside. "You didn't deserve that. None of us do. Thank you for standing." He folded the note, gently placed it beside his phone, and returned to his chair. Later that evening, Elise joined him on the porch. The air was warm, the kind of southern heat that didn't leave even after the sun was gone, and the crickets had started their slow, steady rhythm from the hedges along the yard. "You think it's enough?" she asked, her voice, low eyes scanning the quiet street. CJ exhaled through his nose, watching the shadows stretch across the sidewalk. "It's not about enough," he said. "It's about undeniable. And this they can't explain away." They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that doesn't demand anything but presence. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead, casting a soft circle around them, while the world outside continued shifting inch by inch towards something neither of them could fully name yet. And when the wind picked up gently, carrying with it the distant echo of voices chanting in the square downtown, CJ closed his eyes for just a moment, not to escape, not to rest, but to feel the weight of the truth moving forward without needing his permission. He didn't need to push anymore. The truth had found its legs. The day the department began to fracture started like any other humid slow, with clouds stacking over the harbor and the scent of wet concrete clinging to the sidewalks like memory. But there was something different in the way the precinct buzzed that morning, a kind of anxious static in the air, as though the building itself could feel the pressure mounting from the outside. Officers moved more quickly than usual, glancing down hallways with tight jaws, sidestepping conversations that had once flowed freely over coffee and paperwork. The desk sergeant took calls without eye contact, scribbled messages with a trembling hand, and muttered curt answers into phones that seemed to never stop ringing. CJ didn't go near the station that day. He had no reason to, but he watched everything from a distance with the precision of a man who'd spent decades reading between lines and listening to what wasn't being said. The video had done its work. The protests had reached a boiling point, not violent but focused, growing in number and voice with each passing hour. Across the street from City Hall, someone had set up a speaker system and replayed the audio from CJ's arrest on a loop, not for shock but for remembrance. The sound of his voice, calm, measured, asking for dignity, was now being echoed by thousands who had been waiting for someone to speak first. In a conference room 6 floors above that square, city officials were no longer debating the optics. They were scrambling to salvage what they could before the ground gave way. And behind closed doors, Sheriff Maynard was doing the same, pacing his office in tight, angry circles. The knot of his tie loosened the sleeves of his shirt, rolled past his elbows. His face was flushed, his jaw tight, his usual bravado cracking beneath the weight of something he couldn't control. The footage had cut through his usual tactics like a blade through silk, unraveling months of spin and silence in the space of 94 seconds. "They're not going to let this die down," his deputy said, voice, low eyes shifting toward the blinds. "Even the mayor's office is starting to backpedal." Maynard slammed his hand on the desk hard enough to rattle the picture frames. "It's one man," he snapped. "One man who got mouthy and knew the right people. We've handled worse." But even as he said it, the words tasted hollow, because this wasn't just about one man. It hadn't been for days. CJ's name had become shorthand for something larger, something deeper and older and harder to kill with bureaucratic shrugs or procedural delays. His quiet resolve had outlasted. The rage had pierced through the noise, had become a center of gravity the city couldn't ignore. That afternoon, Maya received a call from a contact at the Department of Justice. The voice on the other end was brisk but respectful, and it came with confirmation that the DOJ had opened a formal investigation into the Charleston Police Department's patterns of conduct, citing CJ's case as the catalyst. It wasn't an answer, it wasn't even justice, but it was movement, it was pressure from above, and it was real. When she relayed the news to CJ, they were sitting at the old wooden table in his kitchen, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the floorboards, the air filled with the faint hum of distant traffic and cicadas, waking from their heat-induced sleep. "They're going to look into all of it," she said, her voice even, but her eyes sharper than ever. "Every complaint, every incident, every piece of paper they tried to bury." CJ didn't smile. He didn't lean back or let out a sigh of relief. He simply nodded slow and deliberate, his fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the warmth grounding him as much as the moment itself. "It's about time," he said softly. That night, news vans lined the streets outside the precinct, cameras pointed toward its brick facade like sentinels waiting for a confession. Protesters lit candles and placed them on the courthouse steps, each flame a small, steady defiance against a system built on shadows. And inside the precinct, officers began whispering to one another in smaller groups, some defending their department, others questioning things they'd long been told to ignore. Cole and Larkin, the 2 officers at the center of it all, were placed on administrative leave. The official statement used vague language, pending review standard protocol, but everyone understood what it meant. Their desks were cleared, their lockers emptied. And in their absence, the building felt different, quieter, uncertain, as if everyone was waiting for the next crack in the wall. CJ didn't attend the press conference the following morning. He watched it from home, seated beside Elise, the 2 of them silent, as city officials stumbled through talking points and carefully worded promises. The mayor called it an inflection point. The police chief vowed reform and accountability. And somewhere in the middle of it all, CJ's name was mentioned, not with credit, but with caution, as if speaking it too clearly might admit how far they'd let things fall. When the screen finally went dark, Elise turned to him, her brow furrowed with frustration. "They still can't just say it," she said, "that what they did was wrong, that what you went through mattered." CJ looked at her for a long moment before responding, his voice low but firm. "They don't need to say it," he said. "Not anymore. The people already know." Outside, the sun had begun to set, and the light spilled across the porch in bands of gold and orange, the air still heavy but no longer oppressive. CJ stood slowly, walked out to the railing, and looked down the street where neighbors were gathering, talking, waving, watching the horizon for signs of what might come next. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel safe, but he felt seen, and sometimes that was the beginning of something better. The courtroom was smaller than it looked on television, less grand, more worn with wood paneling that had faded into a muted, dusty amber, and ceiling fans that hummed steadily overhead, spinning slowly as though even they were waiting to hear what would happen next. C.J. Jennings sat quietly in the front row, not on the stand, not at the defense table, but behind Maya and Elise, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes calm and focused, watching every motion with the clarity of someone who had spent his life understanding how power presents itself when it thinks no one is watching. The suit he wore was not new, but it had been pressed that morning, and the tie navy with a single gold stripe was the same one he'd worn when he gave his final decision from the appellate bench nearly 12 years ago. Larkin and Coles sat at the defense table, their suits ill-fitting, their postures slouched just enough to show they hadn't come prepared for what was about to hit them. The smirks that had once curled confidently across their lips were gone, now replaced by a strange mix of confusion and resentment, like they still couldn't quite understand how they'd ended up here in the same building they once walked through without consequence. Their attorney shifted nervously beside them, flipping through notes that deep down they all knew wouldn't be enough. The judge entered steady, composed with the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. Her name was Judge Renee Foster, and though she didn't smile, her eyes were sharp behind her glasses, and her reputation for fairness came with an edge, sharpened by years of seeing too much and tolerating too little. She glanced around the room, nodded once to the clerk, then opened the day's proceedings without flair or dramatics. This wasn't television. This was justice, and it moved slower, heavier, but more deliberate than anyone raised on courtroom shows might expect. When Maya stood, her voice was clear, each word measured and firm, not rehearsed but rooted in truth. She laid out the facts in a straight line, starting not with CJ's arrest, but with the officers' transfer records, their histories of complaints, their patterns of behavior. She moved through the timeline like a conductor, each piece of evidence falling into place with a quiet authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. The footage from the antique store, the audio from the cruiser, the testimony of witnesses who had seen more than they were initially willing to say. It was all there not as a performance but as a record that could no longer be ignored. The defense tried to push back. They spoke of stress, confusion, departmental culture, the fog of duty, and every other phrase designed to create distance between action and accountability. But it didn't land, because the footage didn't flinch. The timestamps didn't lie. And the bruises on CJ's body told a story no courtroom excuse could rewrite. When the time came for CJ to speak, the courtroom didn't lean forward, didn't hold its breath in cinematic silence. It simply listened, because he didn't raise his voice or ask for sympathy. He simply stood, took a moment to steady his breath, and told the truth the way he always had, clearly, directly, without apology. "I didn't want to be here," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "Not because I'm afraid, but because I've spent a lifetime believing that justice should never require spectacle to function. I waited on a sidewalk for my granddaughter. That's all. I was dressed respectfully. I was calm. And I was assaulted not because I broke the law, but because I disrupted their idea of who belongs where. I'm not here because I asked to be part of a movement. I'm here because silence would have made me complicit, and I've stayed quiet too many times in my life already." There was no applause. No gasps. Just the stillness of a room reckoning with the reality it had tried to look past. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts, excessive force, civil rights violations, falsifying reports. The gavel fell like a heartbeat. Final. Unmistakable. And when it did, CJ closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. Not of victory, but of weight, the kind of weight that doesn't lift with a verdict, but shifts slightly enough to keep standing. Outside, the courthouse reporters waited microphones, angled forward, ready for soundbites and reactions. CJ stepped into the sunlight, slowly, Elise by his side, Maya just behind. The crowd was larger than he expected, but quieter, more reverent, holding signs, not of protest, but of recognition. Someone handed him a folded letter. Another pressed a small pin into his hand, an enamel circle, with the words, "We saw you," in bold black print. He didn't speak to the cameras that day. Instead, he walked down the steps and into the city that had tried to break him, but had instead revealed itself piece by piece. The breeze was warm, brushing lightly against his shoulders, and the bells from a nearby church chimed noon with a sound that rang clear and high above the traffic. He paused at the edge of the sidewalk, glanced at the courthouse behind him, then looked forward toward nothing in particular. And for the first time in what felt like months, maybe longer, he felt his breath move freely through his chest, not heavy, not guarded, but whole. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply stood there beneath the blue Carolina sky, and let the weight of truth settle into the quiet around him. In life, we don't always choose to become a symbol, but it's often our silence that allows injustice to survive. The story of Mr. C.J. Jennings reminds us that at any age, the voice of truth still holds the power to shake a system built on silence and concealment. He didn't win through anger, but through calm resolve, wisdom, and dignity, qualities that age does not take away, but deepens. For those in their later years, the lesson here isn't about becoming a hero, but about never underestimating the value of lived experience and personal integrity. Speak up when it matters, whether through a small action, a well-timed word, or a decision that refuses to compromise. Because sometimes it only takes one person standing tall in the darkness for the light to find its way back in. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in the power of quiet courage.